Hello everybody, hope you're having a good day wherever you are, and welcome to episode 1 of the Poster Podcast. This is a project I've had in the works for a long time, so it feels pretty good to get it started. I hope it's something that people are interested in seeing from me, and I hope it's something that a lot of people have been wanting to see, but didn't realise it yet. I did quite a lot of searching to see if there were any podcasts about specifically posters, and I couldn't find any out there. There's plenty of podcasts about graphic design, movies, and stand-up comedy, but none specifically about about posters. We're off to a great start. I'm hoping this will be quite a long-running project of mine, where I'll do some solo episodes that are just me talking about posters in the media that inspired the poster. I'd like to bring guests on in the future as well, where they bring a poster that's meaningful to them, and maybe one poster that they've personally been on, and we discuss those and see where the conversation goes. But for now, in episode 1, I'm going to be talking about the posters to a stand-up comedy show that I'm currently working on called This One Time. I'll leave a link in the description of this YouTube video in case you want to check out This One Time, as that's probably a lot easier than me explaining it here. The gist of it is it's an improvised stand-up comedy show that uses the stories of the audience members as its fodder. I'm showing one of the posters that I've used most recently on the screen now, and I guess I'll describe it for anybody that's listening just on audio. It's a regular poster with cartoon letters saying "This One Time ... at the top. Underneath it says improvised stand-up comedy. The background is purple and starry, and you can see a bubbling cauldron in the background, like a witch's cauldron, that is filled with yellow and teal slime, I suppose, and there's smoke coming off the cauldron. In the foreground, in front of the cauldron, are the faces of 4 comedians, myself, Maddie Williams, Jared Doherty, and Hamish Mabin Ross. And then at the bottom, there is a photo with all of the date and ticketing information, a QR code, that sort of thing. Quite happy with this design. I think there's still some refinements to be made. I've had a lot of good feedback about this design, but I also think it doesn't necessarily feel like a stand-up comedy poster. So I think I'm going to need to lean more into the showbiz side rather than the witchy, starry, mystical kind of side. But the point of this podcast is actually to illustrate how I got to this design, because it went through so many different names and graphical styles when I was trying to brand the show. So in the beginning, all I had was a document that had the general idea for the show, how it was going to flow, what we were going to do, that kind of thing. And I had a graphic at the top just saying Untitled Improv Show, which is on screen now. And behind that, in the background, a bunches of different coloured craft paper layered across each other, as well as some balls of yarn in the corners. This was the aesthetic I thought I was going to use when we were starting out the show, as I had an idea in my head that maybe we would call it yarn spinners or something along those lines, something to do with yarn. So that was basically just a visual pun I was going for there. We actually didn't end up using this design for long. It was more of a placeholder than anything else, and I quickly moved on to the next iteration of it. Another name that I had in mind was the name Live in the Moment, which is obviously based on the expression of live in the moment. And I'm showing on screen now 2 very early draft posters that I had made. The one on the left I actually quite like, as I created that sketch, if you will, in the Instagram story creator tool at about 3 in the morning. I had this inspiration come to me, and if you'll see, and for the people that are watching, the background is actually a furry red texture, and that was the blanket that I was sleeping under at the time, which I used as the backdrop, hence the red colour kind of stuck. And I think I was just looking for a spotlight graphic in the little GIFs selection area, and the only thing I could find was one that had the Trade Me logo Kiwi in it, which overseas listeners won't know what it is, but Trade Me is a bit like New Zealand's answer to eBay. It was an online auction website, and that's the logo, the little Kiwi. The one that I had revised a little bit to the right is pretty much the same design The layout for those audio listeners has the word live in massive block letters at the top, underneath it saying in the moment. Then a little blurb underneath that saying a totally improvised stand-up comedy show where anything can happen. Underneath that, there are 4 clones of the character from Tig Notaro's Drawn. As when I was playing around with ideas for this poster, I thought it would be cool to commission a local artist to draw the comedians in that kind of cartoony style to have on the poster each time we did it. And then at the bottom we have all the ticketing information, the Can Do Comedy logo, the QR code, etc. The reason I was using this Live in the Moment name is because I've actually had an idea for this show in my head for about 2 or 3 years now. I started attending a Toastmasters club, and they have a section called Table Topics. If you've ever attended a Toastmasters club, you'll know that Table Topics is an improvised speech segment of the night. It's quite a lot of fun. They give you a topic or a question, and you have to, in your head, create a 3-minute speech about or this topic or answering this question. And the reason it's quite fun, or the reason it stuck in my mind, is I realized that there are certain muscles you can build on the fly. So for example, when you're running a speech, everybody kind of knows the structure you're looking for is opening statement or hook, then you set up your premises, you explain the premises, and then you summarize or do a callback, and that's kind of the bones of a really basic speech. And I realized that it was possible to do this on the fly with regular talking, and I thought, well, why can't we do this with stand-up comedy? We know all the techniques, set up, punchline, callback, etc. So why can't we do something similar and come up with a stand-up comedy routine using these techniques we know, but just do it on the fly? So that was the seed of the idea. I wasn't quite sure what formats we were going to use, what segments we would use when we actually did it as a show. Another thing that I wanted to not do is, people have done no material allowed stand-up comedy nights since the dawn of time. There was even a show that's called On the Spot, which was another potential name that I was going to use for this, but it's obviously been done by someone much more successful than me, so I dropped that pretty quickly. But there's a couple of things I don't like about those kind of shows, is especially if you're watching an amateur one or a particularly bad one, is there's so much dead air. The comedian walks across the stage going, what do I talk about next? And pretty much every bit of comedy comes from either what do you do or where are you from? And I just find those shows to be like pulling teeth to watch. So the idea came to me sort of when I was watching Would I Lie to You, which is a massive influence in this the show format. I just had to figure out a way to get the idea of a story that could be the comedians or it could be the audience members happening, and then leave it up to the comedian to perform this story or this piece of material that they've just been placed in front of them as if it was really theirs, trying to do it as convincingly as possible, but while also using the techniques that we've all practiced from doing stand-up comedy to make it really funny. And that was essentially where the gist of the show came from. I figured out if we make all of the audience members just write down a story that happened to them before the show, the comedians all do the same thing, and then we chuck them into the same vessel. In this case we use a cauldron, which is why the cauldron appears on the final poster. So we had the basic concept of the show. I now had to come up with a name and a brand in order to get people to want to see it. And even just by the fact that it's taken me a little bit to kind of explain it in this podcast is something I'm very aware of. I need to work on the elevator pitch, and I need to figure out how to get people to get it, because the hard thing about this show is it's really fun. It's honestly one of the only stand-up shows I leave with my jaw hurting from how hard I've been laughing at the show. And the audience takes them a minute to get on board. The first few are usually quite rough, but by the end of it, they get really into it, and it's a great show. The problem is just getting people in the door. So I acknowledge that there's work to be done here, even after the quote-unquote final result that I'm going to show you, well, I have showed you at the start of this podcast. So the name was an important thing, and this took me a long time to figure out. I'm showing on the screen now the list of possible names that I had when I was starting out this project. I'm going to read them out now for anybody that's just listening on audio. Here are the names. Strench the Truth, Blaggin' Bits, which I think might be a Kiwiism. Blag basically just means to lie or try and convince somebody of something. Tall tales. Spin a yarn, so that was where I had the first idea, spinning a yarn. Yarn spinners comedy night. Bluff the stuff. just the word bluff on my list. Get bluffed, that's not a bad one. Fib, which I think might be another Kiwiism, which just means lie. Telling porkies, I thought this could be quite cool. I could draw the comedians as pigs on the poster. Pants on fire, coming from that old expression of liar, liar, pants on fire. Fact or fib, I think I must have robbed this directly from Would I Lie to You, because I'm pretty sure that's what Rob Dryden says at the start of the show. Yours, mine, and theirs, or yours, mine, or theirs. Bits and pieces, I felt like that was a cool one, because comedy, bit. Storytime soup, this came from the idea of drawing the things out of a bowl or a hat or a cauldron, and I thought it sounded a little bit like the title of an improv troupe. I always like how they have really weird names for improv troupes. They'll have something like Cold Soup or The Red Door, stuff like that. This One Time so as you can see, that ended up being the final title. I had it slightly different on this list, but that was the one we went with in the end. And remember that time, as I noticed my brother and I, when we ask each other about stories from our childhood, we would always use the phrase, remember that time when? So I thought it would stick in people's mind. What do you think about the name I chose based on this list? Leave a comment and tell me which name you would have chosen if you were running this show. I'd love to hear it. Maybe I got it wrong. So the name I ended up choosing for the first version was Yours, Mine, or Theirs, as I felt like that summed up the content of the show quite nicely, as it was whose is the story? Is it yours, is it mine, or is it theirs? So now that I had a name, I had to come up with some branding before it. I'm going to show on the screen now what some of my influences were when I was coming up with this initial branding. For the audio-only listeners out there, I have a graphic from the New Zealand Poetry Slam, which shows two characters with... they're quite hard to describe. They look kind of like they're out of Adventure Time. They have the long, noodly arms that are like swirling and swooping around the graphic, and they're both holding a microphone and kind of facing off as if maybe they're doing like a kung fu kind of fight, standoff. I found a graphic online somewhere about all the different feelings that children might have, and it had these stylized cartoon kids on it with the kind of shaky, wobbly outlines that I thought would be quite good for the people on the poster, as I was still thinking I would probably draw them on the poster at this point. We have a show called Just the Weird Stuff with Steve. Steve is a local comic. His real name is Cameron, and Steve is a character he does. It's sort of like a mime, and the poster is the title of the show with a stylized picture of Steve turned into a painting sort of effect in Photoshop, and the background is a bunch of random scribbles and cartoons, like as if you're looking at the side of a schoolboy's notebook or something like that. There's also a Whose Line Is It Anyway poster that has the same kind of thing. It has the main cast in the middle, and then around the edges it has all the little cartoons of there's an arrow, there's some kind of splatter, an explosion, the word boom, stars floating around, and I felt like this was a good look for an improv show. Maybe it's something I'd seen before. It seems like a lot of them will show the actual people and then cartoon graphics around them to create the idea that it's all happening real, but it's imaginary. I don't know. There's probably a technical term for it, but I'm not really in the improv world, so I don't know what it's called. And then there were a couple of other posters called Applied Improvisation, which has 4 people holding hands jumping, and they're all coloured. It's almost like a Pentatonics, like the Pentatonics album cover on a red background. And then there's one called It's Hot Out Here with 4 silhouettes all touching a horizontal line to symbolise the ground, as the group name is the Grounded Improv Players. I'm showing on the screen now one idea for a logo that I very quickly sketched using the Storytime Soup name, but after I'd seen it actually on the page, I decided I didn't really like it and was going to go with something else. I ended up going for the scribbly graffiti look, and in what was quite a fun process, I actually spent about 2 hours at night just scribbling whatever came into my head with a ballpoint pen on a page of my sketchbook. For the audio listeners, there's a lot of cats in there. There's a broken heart, there's a crown, a mushroom, a flower, a wrench, a snail, a shield, a lot of ice creams, a lot of bears, an American football, a fist, some TNT, that S thing that we used to all draw in our school books, a bag of money with a dollar sign on it, a UFO picking up a person, a leg of turkey, a bomb, an onigiri, a hamburger, a sheep. There's a lot going on in there. I basically just let my mind wander and sketched whatever came into my mind, and it ended up looking quite cool. So I'm showing on the screen now the first two poster ideas that I came up with. They both have very similar layouts. They both have big blue text at the top. In one version, I had the name of the show, Yours, Mine or Theirs, and then in smaller text, and on the spot, stand-up comedy and storytelling show. And then on the right, I had in massive letters, improvised storytelling comedy night, Yours, Mine or Theirs. I wasn't quite sure what the best option was. In my experience, audience members don't really tend to read the posters, or they tend to take away things that I didn't intend them to from the posters, so maybe that's my fault. But the idea was, I thought maybe if we just wrote in big capital letters what it was, people would understand it more than the name of the show, and then once the show picked up a bit of notoriety, we could switch it over and start using the name as the selling point. The rest of the poster isn't too exciting, just has the photos of the comedians on it. I left some room to write a funny title above the comedians' names, and the background was a very faded version of the graffiti pattern that I'd drawn at 2 a.m. Showing on the screen now all the different logo variations I made, just different ways of stacking the letters, yours, mine or theirs, as well as with and without the subtitle of improvised storytelling comedy night. I used a speech bubble as the O in yours, mine or theirs, and then also in the yours in some of the logo versions. I didn't really end up using this branding for anything, but as I made it, I might as well show it off. So a big change to this branding came when I bought the plastic cauldron that we were using to put all of the stories in. I'm still using this cauldron to this day. I'm showing a photo of it on screen now. It's just a small plastic Halloween cauldron that I bought from a costume store. So kind of going with the theme of that Storytime soup, I think I maybe still had this idea that the comedians were the soup in the cauldron. I started putting the comedians coming out of this cauldron with a swirling blue vortex, kind of like the Rick and Morty portal. I got inspired by that, as well as lightning flying out of the cauldron and bars of light and stuff like that. At this stage, I was still using the yours, mine or theirs name and kind of branding, but the whole time it wasn't really feeling right to me, so I was playing around with the layout and trying out some graphics for it, but it still didn't quite feel right. I want to talk about another one of my inspirations that came midway through designing this branding for this one time, and it's a show up in Auckland called The Dice Show. It's run by Paper Goat Productions, and more specifically by a guy called Stephen Lyons, who I actually met in October when I went up to Auckland. He's a really nice guy, super generous with his time, and just a really sweet guy. Gave me all sorts of advice. I was playing the Classic Comedy Club for the first time, so he offered to show me around and show me where everything was. You just can't speak highly enough of Stephen. But he runs the show called The Dice Show, and he, like myself, has a background in graphic design, so he's obviously does very good posters. And I'll just describe the Dice Show poster to the audio-only listeners, as it is a bit of a trip. So in the center of the poster is a large white dice, except all of the pips showing are eyes, and there is blue ghostly flames coming off the one eye, and then the entire dice is surrounded by a ghostly blue fire. There's a green hand reaching up from the bottom of the poster, which is kind of holding the dice, and then above the dice is a big black cloud, I guess you could say, a big black mass. It looks a lot like Kirby Crackle for you comic fans out there, just kind of spewing out of the dice. In the background, you can see mountains and forests, and it's all in a pink hue. And amongst all of the black Kirby Crackle is the logo, The Dice Show, written in big capital letters, with random objects also flying around and presumably out of this dice. There's a microphone, there's a dolphin, there's a croissant, there's a chair, there's a key, a boomerang, and an aeroplane. All of the information for when the show is at the bottom left and the bottom right, with another mass of black Kirby crackle to create some contrast so you can see the text. It's a really well done poster. I was really, really inspired by it. So around this point is when I decided to change the name to This One Time. I think I'd actually forgotten that I had it on the list, but I was talking with some friends after a gig, and the more I said this one time, this one time, this one time, I realised how often we use that phrase in our everyday life when you're telling a story. And I thought, okay, that's it. We've definitely got our show title there with This One Time. So I changed the logo. It's using big wonky sort of cartoon letters, and they're over a cloud background, and beneath it says in blue letters, improvised storytelling comedy. In one version I was still trying to make it work with the graffiti background. I also scaled up the comedian, so instead of our whole body poking out of the cauldron, it's just the head, as I thought that was a funnier image. And then in the version on the right that you can see on screen now, I decided to adopt that Rick and Morty vortex and take it from not just being in the top of the cauldron, but it is now the whole background, and it's a really nice shade of purple. It was at this point that I figured that I was really onto something here. I was really liking the look of the poster, and I felt like it was something distinct, and it was dynamic, and it was interesting, and it had a little bit of humour with the head coming out of the cauldron. So with that, I modified it a little bit more, and I'm showing what the first version of the poster that we ran with when we ran the show in Christchurch is on the screen now. It's the same purple vortex in the background, with an actual photo of the cauldron clear cut at the bottom, with all four of the comics coming out of it. There's lightning and lights and little strips of paper and slime pouring out. It's a very messy, chaotic feeling design, but I really was really happy with it. I think the purple colour is really eye-catching. The green slime is very cool and Halloween-y. And at the bottom, as the usual, there's the ticketing information, the logos of Can Do Comedy and Wonderbar, which is where we did the show, the QR code. And at the top, I'd actually tweaked the logo a little bit. Instead of a cloud being behind the words "This Is One Time," it was a speech bubble, as I felt like that symbolised a story quite well. I'm showing on the screen now the 3 different versions of the logo I created. They are basically just stacked differently for where we needed them on a poster or any kind of design. There's a very wide version, the normal middle-sized version, and then a square version for usually in the corner of videos and stuff like that. So with the brand completed, I was pretty happy with that. I created a whole bunch of online graphics to use to promote the show, things like cover images for Facebook, a square image to share in the Instagram feed, as well as graphics with the individual comics on them, with our head popping out of the cauldron in the centre of the graphic, with a nickname and our actual name shown at the bottom. The nickname thing is something I really like. I sort of got the idea from Hangman Adam Page in AEW. Every time he appeared, the graphics team would have put a funny title above his name. It's actually how he got the nickname of the Anxious Millennial Cowboy. And I think watching back, they actually used to do it in Whose Line Is It Anyway, when Drew Carey was introducing the comedians, he would give them a funny one-off nickname. So that was my way of paying a little bit of tribute to Whose Line by continuing the the funny one-off nickname. So I was quite happy with that initial branding. And then something came along that really changed the game for me in terms of creating graphics for comedy shows, and that was this trend of AI-generated artwork completely exploding into the mainstream, I guess. It was something that I didn't really understand at first, but the more I played around with it, the more I came to really sort of enjoy it. I'm showing on the screen now 8 different images that were all generated by the DALL-E 2 AI artwork program, and they were all generally generated with the prompt of something to the effect of a bubbling witch's cauldron filled with green slime on a purple vortex. And it's really impressed me with how well it interpreted those instructions and just how cool and magical some of these artworks are. I'm aware that AI generated artwork is a little bit of a hot button topic for people right now, and I have to say, I am not really smart enough to contribute in any meaningful way to the discussion. I think that's a conversation for brighter minds than mine. But as a graphic designer, a lot of people have asked me, am I worried about machines eventually taking my job? And I'll explain something to you that might surprise you, is I actually really like the idea of having cheap AI generated artwork for a few reasons. One being, in the past, I've wanted to create a poster concept for a show. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big proponent of paying artists fairly, so I would pay them fairly. But the problem was, when you pay an artist online, you have to go back and forth a few times. It usually takes a few weeks, and if you're paying them well, which I was, it could be expensive, especially for a comedy show that's probably not going to make any money. So the idea of being able to generate really quick concepts using AI artwork, to me as a designer, is actually really, it's a good thing, because especially, it's not just me, quite often our clients have this grand idea in their head of what they want to see for their design, and you spend 3 hours putting it together only for them to go, oh no, I liked it the way it was before. So, like any other thing, I'm sure back in the, when was Photoshop invented? The 90s? People were being asked the same thing. Are you worried about Photoshop making your job extinct, irrelevant? I'm not quite sure what the right word is. And that's the thing, Photoshop didn't replace graphic designers at all. We just learned how to use Photoshop and integrated it into our workflow. And I think that's kind of going to be the role of AI-generated artwork in the future, is it will just be another tool that designers can use to mock things up, come up with a range of concepts quickly, that kind of thing. The only thing I really know about the morality behind an AI artwork is when it comes to people training their AI on artists, not paying anything to those artists, and then charging people to use the AI, which I can imagine we're probably going to have to come up with some kind of rules or laws, whatever you call it, to regulate that. But again, that's something for much brighter minds than I. I don't really have a mind for law or anything like that. And again, I'm not really affected by it. I'm not an artist, so I don't want to speak for artists. I'm showing on screen now the graphic that I used to create the initial poster that I showed you all at the start of this podcast. I don't even know how to describe it. It's just beautiful. I can't tell what the style is. I think I used the prompt digital painting, but it has this lovely sort of almost oil background. The only thing that's a little bit wonky about it is the legs on the cauldron look a bit like when you kill a spider and they fold up to its body, all sort of weird. But other than that, the AI did a really good job of capturing this smoky, bubbling cauldron somewhere in the middle of the mountains or the desert, it looks like. So I extrapolated that design, and I created the range of graphics you see before you here. It's a pretty simple trick to extend the background of graphics. I'll probably show it in another video. It's a little bit hard to explain without showing the actual process of doing it. So that's how I reached the stage that I'm at right now for this one-time branding. I'm basically just using an AI-generated piece of artwork as the base, and then I'm putting the logos and all the comedians and all the other information on and around it, and I think it looks quite cool. It's a good way to get, again, the AI thing is a good way to get very quick, very cheap artwork of just random things that are really hard to describe to a human to draw. So now I'd like to evaluate this design, as I'm not 100% satisfied with the results. I've seen it up in the window of Dog with Two Tails in Dunedin, which was the venue that we performed this in, and it didn't really stand out, and it also wasn't really clear as to what kind of show this is. There are photos of the comedians on it, and it does repeatedly say stand-up comedy. All the pictures of the comedians are holding microphones, but I still feel like I can make some changes to it to make it feel a bit more like a stand-up comedy show. Something I've been playing around with a lot is the idea of the red curtain. That's a pretty classic piece of showbiz stand-up comedy imagery, I guess, if you will, alongside that silver 1940s microphone, which one of my earlier comedy mentors, Ollie Horn, absolutely hated when I put that on any posters. So if you're listening, Ollie, shout out to you. You'll be happy to know that I didn't use that kind of microphone in this design. I'm also wondering if maybe I'm trying a little bit too hard to represent the essence of the show in the poster, when, in my experience, the audience in New Zealand don't tend to actually really read the posters for comedy shows. I've opened up many comedy shows in the past and asked the audience if they liked the poster, and most of them just looked at me like they had no idea what I was talking about. So maybe the move for the next version of this poster is to simplify it a little bit and make it look a bit more like a generic comedy poster, but mention on it that the nature of the show is that it is an improvised stand-up comedy performance. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I think really it's just a matter of trial and error. I'm going to have to keep trying new things with this branding and see what elements that I've used entice people to come and see the show. That's also partially why I wanted to do this one as my first entry in the poster podcast, as I think where the branding of the show is now is going to look very different to what it's going to look like in a year's time. So this could be a fun little thing to redo every year and see where the branding of the show is at. Kind of like a fun little memory experiment for me to see the roots of what I hope is going to become a big touring comedy show. That brings me to the end of the first episode of the Poster Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and I hope maybe you learned something about graphic design. Leave a comment below if you have any ideas as to how I could make this branding a little bit more accessible to non-comedy fans. That's an interesting thing about asking people for advice on my posters, is quite often people don't want to tell me what they think about it because they say, I'm not a designer, I'm not qualified to give you feedback. But the thing is, 99.9% of the people that come to these shows are also not designers. It doesn't matter what designers think when they see it. I need to know what the average everyday person who's going to buy a ticket and come to the show thinks when they see it. So especially if you're not a designer, I'd love it if you could give me some feedback in the comments, maybe write little bits and pieces that were difficult for you to understand, and maybe suggest what I could do to make it clearer to you as to what the format of the show is, or just to make it more enticing for you to come and see the show. So with that, I'm going to end the main part of the Poster Podcast, and I'm going to begin the Poster Pod After Dark. This is the part of the podcast where I basically just talk for about 10 minutes about what's going on in my life, stuff that's maybe unrelated to posters, stuff that's going on in New Zealand and comedy, whatever really comes to mind. The reason I'm doing it at the end of the podcast is because I listen to a lot of comedy podcasts, and nothing chaps me more than when you click on a podcast because you want to hear the interview with the guest they've got on that podcast, and then you have to either sit through or skip through like 25 minutes of the host just talking about what's going on in their life at the top of the podcast. And to me, that's something I find really frustrating. So I'm not going to do that to you, the listener. I'm going to put all this stuff that you probably don't care about at the end. So if all you want to hear about is posters, go ahead and finish the podcast now. But if you want to know what's going on in my life, then keep listening and maybe it'll be interesting to you. So I'm recording this today on Boxing Day. I've actually found, the reason I'm doing this today is because I found basically the most comfortable way possible for me to record using the setup that I have. I have these two little Yeti, what are they? Yeti Blue? Yeti Pro? Something like that? Little Yeti mics, but I don't have those boom arms that you see in a lot of podcasts. So it's been such a struggle to record voiceover for comedy promos, other podcasts and stuff like that up until this point, because the way I was setting it up was sitting in my room, putting the box of the Yeti down, sitting the Yeti on top of that, and then I had to crunch over and talk into the microphone that way. But as of today, I figured out that if I sit it on the edge of the arm of my sofa, I can actually lay down on the sofa, talk into the mic properly, and I can still breathe when I'm doing it. I'm not like forced to crunch over and suffocate myself. So the time of talking now, I've been recording for about 45 minutes, and it seems to have worked. I'm pretty happy with the results. I've had to shut all the doors and windows because I live on a very busy main road in my town, and because it is Boxing Day, everyone and their dog is driving along the main roads to get out of the city, and they're towing horse floats and caravans and boats on trailers and all that kind of thing. So every couple of minutes you get this big roar as all this traffic goes past. So I'm currently cooking a little bit, but I'm almost done with the podcast, so I'm not too unhappy about that. I'm quite pleased. It's definitely been more comfortable than my usual recording sessions have been. Got a couple gigs left for the year. I've got, on the 28th of December, I'm driving up to Motueka to do a show at the Motueka Hotel with my good friends at DIY Comedy. We're doing a show called One Night Stand in Motueka. DIY Comedy are pretty much my favourite group to gig with in all of New Zealand. Ben Tito Caldwell, the guy who runs it, is one of the most magnificent people in stand-up. I cannot say enough good things about Ben. He's just been fantastic to me, and he always puts on a hell of a show. So I'm really looking forward to going up there to play the Motueka Hotel. I'm expecting it's going to be a pretty blue-collar, how-you-going sort of audience. So I'll probably bring out what my good friend Reg Blackwood calls knob gags. So it'll probably be a pretty raunchy night of entertainment. And then on the 31st, we have one gig left, which is run by my little company, Can Do Comedy. We're doing a New Year's Eve comedy night at Union Fair from 8 o'clock until 10 o'clock. It costs $65 for a ticket, but 50 of that actually goes towards a delicious 3-course meal that's just included in your ticket fee. So 3 courses for $50 is pretty much unheard of in this economy, so that is a hell of a deal. And then on top of that, you get a very funny comedy show with myself, Tina D, and Matt Threadwell of Can Do Comedy. We are the 3 members, for those you don't know. And then we've also got Deb Webb joining us, and I like Deb a lot. She's very funny. She's very, very easy to work with, and I've got all the time in the world for Deb. I've kind of run out of things to talk about, but I guess the last thing I'll talk about is where I'm at. I don't know about you guys listening, but I found this year the end of year crunch particularly taxing. I don't know what it is about this year, but I don't know if you heard that, but it sounded like a goose or something just honked in the background. I'm going to leave that in the edit. But yeah, the end of year crunch I found particularly taxing this year. We've had a very weird summer in New Zealand this year. It's been way colder than it normally is for some reason. More often than not, the days end very overcast and windy and almost raining, which I love, but it's really concerning when you think we're meant to be in the middle of summer right now. I don't want to get on the environmental soapbox, but it definitely does seem pretty hard to deny climate change when we're having cold summers and then really warm winters. But yeah, the end of year crunch was a difficult one. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe because I've been in this job for a little bit longer, so it's not new anymore. It's just kind of routine. We were a lot busier this year, which really sucked for me because I had to do so many ads. I'm a graphic designer by trade, in case you haven't picked that up by now. Me talking about graphic design constantly this episode. So yeah, I've got about a week to chill out before these 2 gigs, and then Can Do Comedy, we're taking January off, which means I'm going to have a shitload of time to work on any little video projects I have in mind. I'm going to have to do a massive overhaul of my YouTube channel. The way I set things up was I was a bit of a silly billy. To be fair, shorts weren't a thing when I was uploading most of my clips to YouTube, and most of the joke clips I uploaded are like less than 30 seconds long, so they should really be shorts. So that's something I'm going to have to get stuck into, is reformatting my YouTube. I've gotten sick of the thumbnails as well. I thought they were really cool. I was basically just ripping off Brandon Sanderson's thumbnails when I first put them up, but I don't know. I don't like them anymore, and I want to redo them. So I'm going to do that. I think I'm really just talking for the sake of talking now, so I'll bring an end to it there. I hope you've enjoyed this After Dark segment. As always, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I think that's all the social media profiles I have. They are all under Taylor Ruddle Comedy. I'm really happy that I actually managed to get the same name for each of them. I can't do the same for Can Do Comedy, which is a massive thorn in my mind. But anyway, thanks for listening. Give me a subscribe on YouTube if this kind of thing interests you and you want to see more poster podcasts. We'll see you next time. I have been Taylor Ruddle, and that was the Poster Podcast.